Radiant energy.
Radiant energy.
If America's economy runs hot, what happens to the rest of the world?
If America's economy runs hot, what happens to the rest of the world?
When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
But what happens when it runs a fever?
But what happens when it runs a fever?
After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3. After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3.5%,
After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3.5%,
America is poised to enjoy a robust rebound in 2021.
America is poised to enjoy a robust rebound in 2021
simply by returning to something like normal as vaccination proceeds.
simply by returning to something like normal as vaccination proceeds.
Yet it might manage more than just that.
Yet it might manage more than just that.
If President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief bill is enacted,
If President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief bill is enacted,
total stimulus this year may exceed $2.5 trillion. Total stimulus this year may exceed $2.5 trillion.
total stimulus might exceed $2.5 trillion this year.
That could easily push output above
what
the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
What the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
The amount the economy can produce.
That is the amount the economy can produce.
Without an increase in inflationary pressure.
Without an increase in inflationary pressure.
This possibility, as some American economists of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
On the lookout for signs of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
Should overheating occur, its effects will not be confined within its borders. Depending on how the recovery plays out. A hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world.
A hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world.
Or yet another source of concern. In a closed economy that does not trade with the rest of the world. Too little spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
Too little spending leads to unemployment and downward pressure on prices.
Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
While too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
In an open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand
in the open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand
spill over to the rest of the world. A sharp drop in spending, for instance,
may
be associated with plunging demand for imports. In which case, some of the pain of a slump is exported abroad. During the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9, troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world. Troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world.
Troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world.
But even countries relatively insulated from those woes
But even countries relatively insulated from those woes
felt a chill thanks to trade links with America and Europe.
felt a chill thanks to trade links with America and Europe.
According to one estimate, about a quarter of the drop in American demand
According to one estimate, about a quarter of the drop in American
and
spending
a fifth of the fall in European demand
and a fifth of the fall in the European
demand and a fifth of the fall in European
and a
demand
fifth of the fall in European demand
was borne by other economies
was,
and transmitted through trade.
was borne by other economies and transmitted through trade.
A boost to demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
A boost to demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaks abroad.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaks abroad.
Through purchases of foreign goods, for example.
Through purchases of foreign goods, for example.
Or spending on services, including tourism,
Or spending on services, including
which
tourism,
should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
that should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
An analysis of fiscal policy spillovers
An analysis of fiscal policy spillovers
published by the IMF in 2017 found that an American stimulus consisting mostly of spending as opposed to tax cuts
that an American stimulus consisting mostly of spending as opposed to tax cuts
and worth 1% of GDP
and worth 1% of GDP
raises the output of the average country by 0.33% in the first year.
raises the output of the average countries by 0.33% in the first year.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
The fillip to Canada's economy is estimated to be
The fillip to Canada's economy is expected to
almost three times the
estimated to be
average, for example.
almost 3 times the average, for example.
If the combination of reopening and stimulus
If the combination of reopening and stimulus
invigorates the American consumer, the effects could quickly be felt all over the world.
invigorates the American consumer, the effects could be felt all over the world.
The degree to which it is felt, however,
The degree to which it is felt, however,
depends crucially on the policy response both at home and abroad.
depends crucially on the policy response both at home and abroad.
Fiscal spillovers are more powerful
Fiscal spillovers are more powerful
when recipient countries are themselves operating below potential.
when recipient countries themselves are operating at below
Countries are themselves operating below potential.
when recipient countries themselves are operating below potential.
American spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world
American spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world
if its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners.
if its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners.
Ordinarily, spillovers provide a strong incentive
Ordinarily, spillovers provide a strong
governments
incentive
to coordinate their stimulus efforts,
for governments to coordinate their stimulus efforts,
lest some tight-fisted economies, for example those in Europe,
that some tight-fisted economies, like those in Europe,
free ride on the largesse leaking from more generous ones.
free ride on the largest, looking for more generous
Indeed,
ones.
on February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary,
Indeed, on February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary,
urged her counterparts in the G7 group of countries to go big on stimulus too. Countries that free ride could find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen.
Countries that free ride could find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen.
The Biden administration has promised to be stern with countries
The Biden administration has promised to be stern with
that run large,
countries
persistent trade surpluses.
that run large, consistent trade surpluses.
But if America does come close to overheating, then a reluctance to spend elsewhere may be less irksome than usual.
Then a reluctance to spend elsewhere may be less irksome than usual.
Demand-starved countries. As demand-starved countries serve as a release valve,
As demand-starved countries serve as a releasing
for the
valve
pressure building up at home.
for pressures building up at home.
Growth in global trade seems to have enhanced its pressure-relieving capabilities.
Growth in global trade seems to have enhanced its releasing capabilities.
According to work by Jane Ihrig, Stephen Kamin, Deborah Lintner, and Jamie Marquez of the Federal Reserve.
According to work by A, B, and C of the Federal Reserve,
They reckon that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link
they reckoned that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link
changes in domestic demand and corresponding shifts in total output.
between
Corresponding shifts between changes in domestic demand and corresponding shifts in total output.
Between changes in domestic demand and the corresponding changes in the total output,
with net exports bearing more of the burden
with net exports bearing more of the burden
of adjustment to changes in domestic spending.
In
In the late 1990s, for instance, measures of domestic demand grew even faster
In the late 1990s, for instance, the measures of domestic demand grew even faster
than real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip.
than real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip.
Inflation remained relatively subdued, however, in part.
Inflation, for example,
Inflation remained relatively subdued, however, in part.
Inflation remained relatively low. Inflation remained relatively subdued, in part
because America's current account deficit swelled. Similarly, a surge in imports this year might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America. Might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America.
Might dissipate America's potential inflationary pressure in America,
while giving a lift to its weaker trade partners. The biggest uncertainty about the global effects of a hot American economy The biggest uncertainty about the global effects of a hot American economy is the reaction of the Fed. Recent work by Kristen Forbes of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology
Recent work by A of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology
suggests that domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors,
suggests that domestic inflation has become more responsive to global factors,
including the amount of economic slack across the global economy as a whole.
including the economic slack across the global economy as a whole.
Yet wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions. Yet wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions.
Yet wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic factors, domestic conditions.
The Fed might therefore shrug off price rises later this year.
The Fed might therefore shrug off price rises later this year.
Reckoning that short-run price pressures will not translate into sustained inflation.
Reckoning that short-run price pressures will not translate into sustained inflation.
Until America's job market and the world economy is fully recovered.
Until America's job market and the world economy is fully recovered.
A dovish Fed should make for a weaker dollar.
A dovish Fed should make for a weaker dollar.
And easier financial conditions worldwide.
And easier financial conditions worldwide.
Adding to the boost that comes from Americans buying more goods from abroad.
Adding to the boost
buying more. Adding to the boost that comes from Americans buying more goods from abroad.
Adding to the boost that comes from Americans buying more goods from abroad.
But a really rip-roaring economy could test the Fed's patience.
But really, a rip-roaring economy could test the Fed's patience.
Particularly if a yawning current account deficit.
Particularly if particularly a yawning current account deficit.
And soaring asset prices. Cause it to worry about a build-up of financial risk.
Cause it to worry about a build-up of financial risk.
The specter of American interest rate hikes.
The specter of American interest rates hiked
could frighten global markets and force emerging economies.
Could frighten global economy.
Emerging economies could frighten. Global markets and force emerging economies
could frighten global markets and force some emerging economies
to adopt less stimulative fiscal and monetary policies.
To adopt less stimulative
fiscal and to adopt less stimulative fiscal and monetary policies.
To adopt less stimulative fiscal and monetary policies.
A bit of demand spilling over from America would seem insignificant in comparison.
A bit of demand spilling from America would seem insignificant in comparison.
That the Fed will suddenly turn hawkish still seems unlikely.
That the Fed will suddenly turn hawkish still seems unlikely.
But if America's temperature runs high enough,
the
rest of the world may break out in cold sweats.
The rest of the world may break out in cold sweat.